It's such a joy to be back on Testimony Mountain with Jessie Czebotar. I know that she's come to mean so much to me. Her journey, her story is so inspiring. And so just encourage you to like, share, subscribe to this channel, and pass it on. And as we were just chatting a few minutes before, we were looking at overcoming persecution. And oftentimes in the States, we really don't think anybody's really getting persecuted like back in Jesus's day or something like that. But it is still happening. And so just wanted you to share a little bit, Jessie, what you have gone through for standing for truth and righteousness, and your mindset, how you've overcome through this.
Yeah, really a great topic. And, for me, I had a friend that years ago, as I was working through problems in my own family, he had encouraged me, learn to focus on the problem and not the people.
Mhm.
And I think in, that aspect of being persecuted, it's very easy to quickly, focus on a person. And then as that happens, you're dealing with emotions of anger, fear, sadness, and that can then turn into, you know, um, we'll say bitterness, feelings of rejection, other things, guilt, shame. Um, And then when that happens, it tends to tear up or destroy relationships, and it makes it really hard to get through the problem because you're so emotionally invested in trying to resolve or figure out or work through the process of what's happened in the ending of a relationship or in betrayal. Um, so that was one of the first things that I had learned, and it's harder to put it into process than, um, just speaking about it.
Yes.
Um, for me, as I've come forward with my story, obviously I've had family members that have gone against that are part of the system or the occult. But I've had to learn to say, okay, I'm going to put up boundaries and I'm going to still go forward in that truth and I'm going to speak that truth, um, and not be afraid to speak it. Um, that was probably the heaviest point of persecution. And then, with certain testimonies against certain individuals, then I have had an influx of, other individuals that, have been attacking because of that. And, what I encourage people, it's actually not an old method. The system has used that method for many years where, they want to discredit, they want to, when I was growing up, a lot of times they called it the crazy making game, where, they did this to certain people in my family that, when they tried to come against what was happening in the rituals, or, they wanted to defect or bring out something, then the entire family would turn against that individual and kind of scapegoat them. And then they would begin to make comments that, would revolve around that individual's mental health. Oh, well, you must be having nightmares, or, that must all be in your head. We all know that that doesn't happen. Or, they may even threaten and say, good girls keep their mouth shut. They don't air the family's dirty laundry. Um, so, with that, then it makes the individual feel like first they have to keep that code of silence, that they're bound to the silence and they can't tell their story or what happened, and they can't even speak about it. Some individuals in the system at the higher levels are even programmed that their body will automatically go into a self-destruction mode, whether that's a major health issue that kicks in. There's some individuals I'm aware of that literally they start going into cardiac arrest if they start talking about the things that they witnessed or saw. There's others that immediately become suicidal and start having suicidal ideation. So those were ways that the system programmed people so that they could safeguard the system. And, some of the survivors, they allow them to, be able to speak out that, yes, there's a cult. Yes, there's satanic ritual. Yes, there's sexual abuse that happens. Um, yes, I harmed someone or participated in, drinking adrenochrome or other things. They'll let certain truths about the system go forward,
Mhm.
but they never allowed the full story, the full details, um, the full amounts of information to go forward from those people. They'll keep it confined and controlled.
Mhm.
So that's been part of the, with the breakthrough is it really has taken a miracle and an act of God to be able to get my testimony one in, affidavit form, but then to be able to get it into the courts or into the military JAGs, um, because there's so much coming against the system, against me from the system. Um, so I don't know if you experienced some of that in your coming out. The heavy, persecution is a good word for it, but basically it's increased spiritual attacks, where that are meant to silence and to keep you from sharing information or finding out information too.
Yeah, I think that for me, and I haven't come out with all of the fullness publicly at this point, but the little bits that I have noticed an uptick in that, but often more subtly, with family members saying just certain things that I know what they're meaning underneath.
Mhm.
Um,
The
and so,
double speak talk
yes.
that sounds nice, but really it's a nasty cut.
Yes. And so, sometimes that's harder to deal with because it starts messing, with your mind to go, well, maybe I shouldn't be saying this. Maybe it's not true. Maybe I am crazy, and those types of things um, that make it difficult. And so I would say there's subtle forms of persecution, and then there's,
Mhm.
very obvious.
Extreme, yeah, it escalates to extreme forms. Maybe that would be good to define what would you say are some of the more subtle techniques that you've experienced.
I think part of what I noticed is like every time I made a breakthrough, um, there was something to squash it or to go
Mhm,
like, oh, you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't have. And I went through a process of where I felt like God wanted me to actually destroy some things with fire that
mhm,
had been in the family generation. And I know sometimes you can just pray over them and wash it with the blood of Jesus. But this particular item felt like I just needed to burn it. And it
mhm,
felt so good. I took a hammer. I had took a hammer to it and, broke it up into little pieces and, started this fire. And it was just deeply freeing for me.
mhm,
And then I had a family member come along and just be like, why did you do that? You shouldn't have done that. That was a keepsake, those types of things. And um, it was just, and I mean, and that multiplied in many different things. One time I'd thrown something away that I was just like,
mhm.
I need to get rid of this. And, it was one of those crazy things where, um, it'd been in the garbage, it went out to the driveway, and the wind came up and knocked it over. Dogs got in it. And this family member found this item
Oh, no.
and
So you
brought
were
it
caught
in.
red-handed throwing
Yes,
it
I
out.
was like, "How could you get rid of this? Why are you getting rid of this?" And it had been such a struggle for me to do it in the first place, just to be
Mhm.
candid. I put it in the garbage, and then I got it out of the garbage. I put it in the garbage, I got it out of the garbage. And, finally, I'm like, "This is ridiculous. Why am I hanging on to something that, I don't even know the full significance of it, but I just know I
Mhm.
really need to let go of it.
Right.
And so I waited a little bit, and then it went back in the garbage again.
Mm.
But it just felt like this, not super obvious, but just this, every time I'm
Mhm.
trying to do something, there's
The
something that is
kiboshing.
doing it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's a great way, the enemy often attacks like that too and makes you question or and it's that sense of insecurity. Um and he confuses that insecurity, but the truth is that, the object or the item or whatever it is that we're having to get rid of, like we know we don't want it. We
mhm,
know that we don't like it, that it makes us feel terrible.
mhm.
But then the enemy hits that emotional side of, well, but this is the only thing you have to remind you of that, um, that family member. This is, and you're like, but every time I see that, all I think about is the torture and the horrific traumas that I experienced from that person.
Yeah. Yeah, and at least for me, a lot of my programming was do whatever the man says. And, that has been a a process to overcome
Mhm,
because it's so deeply rooted that, I would just comply without even thinking about it,
mhm,
and they go, wait a minute, I have a choice now to say yes or no. And
right.
and even in situations where it's not a torture, that type of thing, but it's just so programmed in that pathway, to go, oh, I've got to do it. If a man said it, I've got to do it. And
And you're like, but no, I want to make the choice,
yeah,
and I really don't want this item. You know?
yeah. And I so appreciate what you said about really separating the person, from the situation, because I think
Mhm,
that, we can get so much into, um, we can get into a persecution complex. And, you can
mhm,
see that with some survivors is it's like, they're doing this to me, they're doing that to me, they're doing this to me, they're doing that to me. And after a while, it gets sickening. It's
yeah,
like, this isn't, I'm not seeing the power of the Lord in that. And that's what I so appreciate about
right.
you is I know you've been under a lot of heavy persecution in many different forms, but you haven't been vitriolic, um, you know, in that
Yeah.
victim complex.
But it's learning to release the permissions to yourself.
Mhm.
We've talked about that heavy, burden of perfectionism that we
Yeah.
both grew up carrying, and along with that, highly comes the people pleaser
Yep.
and the peacemaker, where you learn that you have to, everything that you do, you really do enjoy being the peacemaker. You enjoy, um, being that people pleaser and giving gifts and doing most of it, is when we say giving gifts, it's not, buying or giving, item gifts. How we give is through service.
Yeah.
And so, when you serve, it's to please the other people, to make them happy. But then when they're not pleased with it, it really causes that, value complex because you feel like you are not good enough or you're not worthy or you're not doing it right. And everything around your self value comes out of that perfectionism and that you register and evaluate that perfectionism by the reactions of others
Mhm.
instead of learning to stand on your own and to say, well, I'm choosing to do that. And if they're not happy with it, well, that's fine. That's their choice.
Yeah.
I'm still going to give the gift anyway. I'm still going to help them out and being okay with it and being okay to walk away while somebody's angry. And I think that's the biggest trigger right there for us because as children, we were trained that we could never walk away
Mhm.
when somebody was angry.
Yeah.
we had to take the anger and bear that anger, and in a way, we took the full guilt for whatever they were angry about.
Mhm.
And, learning that we're no longer responsible to have to carry
Yes.
that guilt or that shame or that responsibility
Mm.
for that person's anger.
Yeah. That's so good. And, the way the Lord showed it to me, because for me, I had also, in my understanding of what part of what I was used for as an empath was to manage, girls who were being trafficked.
Mhm.
And so part of that empath was to, carry their grief, their sorrow, their rage, all of that so that they would be
Mhm.
compliant. And, it was like this big warehouse inside with all these barrels of toxic emotions,
Mhm.
that I've been carrying that wasn't even mine, but was other people's, that I thought I needed to carry to be the good girl, to fulfill my role in the system and all of those kinds of things. And, what a relief to be able to, before the Lord, be able to pour out all that toxic stuff and get it out of
Right.
me, that I believe was actually causing physical damage to my body, with those emotions. So,
Yeah. Well, like what I've learned is that, that I called it responsibility.
mhm,
Um, but with that responsibility, there also has to come forgiveness.
yes.
Forgiveness for myself, forgiveness for the regrets that I had over, where I wished I would have made different decisions. And that's really where it comes in, is that you realize that in that trying to please others, there's a destructive enabling cycle that you are allowing to constantly continue.
Mhm.
And when you realize that you can break free from that cycle and that you don't have to comply to it, that's where really the empowering and the overcoming comes.
Yeah. So I'm curious because you had some of that people pleasing, but also you stood up against the system, which I have always admired because I feel like I just
Yeah.
gave in to it, in my situations. But where did that come from? Was that part of your personality design, or was there something, God given that enabled you to step out of that?
Yeah, no, I think really it was God given. I one of my ways that I show love is through giving,
Hmm.
and I love to, serve people. I love to help. I'm a helper. Um, so for me, it's like that's how I experience love or receive love is through togetherness.
Hmm.
So it's like when I'm just together with people, walking in the same direction, that's where I feel loved.
Hmm.
And so for me, really that was, there wasn't safe other ways that I felt love. So for me, it kind of allowed me to keep that distance from certain family members, by the no touching, no physical contact. But yet we were just always in that place. And then it's like, well, let me help you with the dishes. Let me help clean up. And I'm very task orientated. So cleaning was one of the ways that I mostly expressed love
Hmm.
to my family members. And then that became kind of like a intensive drive where, that perfectionism really started to take hold because it was like then I had to always be cleaning and that became a real, at the same time it was my outlet.
Yeah.
F my in a way it's kind of a healthy outlet because you're, funneling that anger and that energy in a way that you're getting something done productively, efficiently. So it's kind of it's a there's some healthy aspects to it, but really what was happening in my life was not healthy overall. because I was constantly feeding that perfectionism cycle and, um, not getting the healing, not getting out of the unhealthy cycles. Um, for me, it wasn't, others that I saw in the system, instead of cleaning, their physical appearance became their focus where, I have to have the makeup perfect, I have to have my hair perfect, I have to have my body look perfect. I didn't take it in that direction.
Mhm.
Thankfully I always had a, you know, confidence about myself and who I was, and honestly didn't care what how people viewed me. So the Lord had to actually break that too, because that was, there was a lot of ways I was dishonoring the Lord with that.
Mhm.
I was the type, it's like I just want to have my hair out of my face. I don't want it, being all staticky, sticking all over in my way. I want my hands free so I can do.
Mhm.
And the Lord, it was actually through Right on Radio Jeff actually that the Lord started to really pick at that further and said, "You're missing out. Like, do you not see, how beautiful I've made you? Do you not see that I want you to enjoy
Mhm.
the beauty I've given you?" And in that, there's an expression of love when you stop and you say, "Wow, Lord, you took the time to form me in the womb, to form me this way. If there's things I don't like, I can work at that.
Mhm.
I can change some things, about my appearance. If there's weight issues, well, the honest truth is I haven't been a good steward of my diet. I need to eat better. So there's things that you can adjust and take control over. But the Lord wanted me to stop and to appreciate, how he had made me. And
Mhm.
it actually did start with the hair, which was really funny. And Jeff was getting into the My Liberty stand,
Mhm.
and they had a great shampoo, and it was funny because that was the first thing. It was like, oh, my hair feels actually soft and silky, and I want to, it was like, oh, I can actually wear it down. Like, my kids still, they like, we went someplace actually around Christmas time, and they were, looking for me, and all of a sudden, like, they turn around and I'm like right there, and they're like, oh, that's you, and they're like, we're so not used to you wearing your hair down, because for, the majority of their life, I've never had it down, not once, so kind of funny.
And that's interesting. I think for me, it was perfection in, school and scholastic and all of that. And I
The
shared how I,
intellectual
yeah,
perfectionism,
yeah.
yeah.
Um, and the looks didn't matter so much. And I think I was in a system that you didn't want to draw attention to yourself. So kind of
Mhm.
the plainer you look, the better in a lot of ways. And so um, but the cleaning, my mom was more the cleaner, and but it was funny because I when I was 12, my parents were running a vegetarian restaurant, and so I would participate. But what I realized is that if I had a washcloth in my hands and if I was in motion, nobody would ask me to do anything. But I,
So you would just sit there and look like you're doing
no.
stuff, right?
Because I was moving and the cloth was moving, and I was going around, then nobody'd ask me to do some yucky chore.
You faked it just to look like you were making it,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, that was kind of the name of the game.
Oh, that's hilarious, actually. Um, I don't think, I was the type that like I couldn't like I really struggled to play that game of deception, like I wasn't like if I was supposed to do it, I would do it because it would drive me crazy to not complete the task, whatever it
Yeah.
was. And for me, it was more important at the end goal, I wanted them to be pleased
Mhm.
and I wanted them to acknowledge, the task that I had completed and that I had, I also wanted to excel in whatever it was. Like there was that, you know, at in some sense, that I wanted to be recognized, but at the same time, there was that heavy suppression too, like you said, where, you know, the goal was not necessarily to draw attention to yourself.
Mhm.
So really it's a mixed up world because, when you grow up on in the light side, you're chosen, you're special, there's special things that come with that. Yet, if you openly accept those things and appreciate them, well, now you're not humble.
Yes, yes.
And now you're prideful and you need to repent of that. So, you really like, what the heck is expected of me? Like, you have all this authority and power, but you can't ever use it. Um, you can't openly express it however you want in a honest, good way,
Yeah,
because that's where our hearts naturally we went towards the good of things, and that was not allowed.
yeah,
But if you wanted to express that authority in an evil way, by all means, carry on as much as you want. You're in the learning process. It's okay, right?
yeah,
It was just like, I mean, there were times I did things just to spite them, because I would get so mad about it, you know, and like I think back, I would do like I would creatively try to think of things with my training partner to mess up the ritual prep or the rituals. So, one of our favorite stories, I think I've shared this on one of my shows along the way. We were really bad, but and we had to do things that were against my nature, like, so it really was a challenge for me, but the goal was that he needed Tang. And, the old orange little powdered drink that you would
yes.
drink. Now, we had a bunch of it in our cupboard. So I had to steal it basically and, get it into a Ziploc bag that I hid on my body and get out of the house with it. So I did that. I had no idea what he was going to do with it. I just knew it would be good and that it would appease both of our need to spite the system, right? So he gets the Tang and he breaks into um the cabinet area or the little, it's actually like a little room area where they keep the holy wine and the wine for communion and the wafers. And he proceeded to dump that Tang into the communion wine. So, it was like, I think late like the next day or the next morning or whatever, back then at that time, the priest at that church, he still did he would stand on the bottom of the altar and the people would get into a line and one by one you'd go up and you'd stick your tongue out. He would dip the wafer into the cup and then put the wafer on your tongue. So people stood in the line and he went to, dip the wafer, and it totally helped that those, communion cups are made out of copper because it hid the orange color of the Tang. So he dips the wafer and it comes up orange. But, he's not gonna not perform communion. So he sticks that wafer on the person's tongue, and so we got the whole, the whole service sat there watching all the looks as these people got the wafer, that the Tang made it kinda zippy, which was even better. And we were, but we had to keep posture, like, "Oh, this is interesting. Nobody's gonna say anything." But inside we were like just hysterically laughing at that one.
Wow,
But
wow.
we would purposely mess things up just to, his favorite thing was as we were in procession for rituals, there was a certain line, like with the mothers, you'd have, the queen mother was always in front because I was her successor and learning to take that position and place that she had. I literally would be like right behind her. It was like not even like a full. arm to elbow length, it was literally just inches in front of her. If I stepped wrong, I literally was stepping on the back of her feet. And then I'd have two mothers on each side of me, and then there would be two behind them. And then for some of the ritual prep, they would have, my training partner walking right behind me. And then as we got into place, like he would take a place like in the back right behind me. So what he loved to do was, as we were in that procession, all of a sudden his little foot would come out right in front of mine, and I would go toppling over and take down the whole stack of mothers with me. So yeah.
Wow.
So we would do things to sabotage the perfectionism at times, but you know.
That's so funny. I love your stories because it just brings some lightness into it, that it, as the stuff that happened was horrendous and horrible. But when we
Yeah.
can keep our sense of humor and be able to keep on moving forward.
I think we need to make light, like when I think back through or I'll say when I do memory work, I try to bring out those funny little details, the things that, like what was my reaction in that situation and how did I really feel? Because in the moment, I was only afforded one of three emotions the majority of the time. And that was either anger, everything was good, or sadness.
Yeah.
Now, I was one that I did not allow myself to go down that sad road,
Mhm.
because for me it was a dangerous emotion because I saw it led down the road of suicide and destruction and despair.
Mhm.
So I literally, nope, not even gonna go there. So I tended to go, my main operational emotion was anger.
Mhm.
And that can be definitely a two-way dangerous sword because on the one hand, you know, things would get shoved down and I wouldn't deal with them, but that was how I had to control that intense anger was just to shove it down. On the other hand, there would be moments where that anger would just come out and, you know, there was it was just like that uncontrollable force then. So, in that process, I try to think, well, what was I actually thinking at that time? What was I sensing? And, that's when I start to remember all the little looks, that would be between people and it would be like, I remember right before that ritual, that I saw my proctor and she was debating.
Hmm.
And I could tell that she really didn't want to participate, that she was weary of it,
Mhm.
that she was sad about it. And I would pick up on those emotions. And then, I would notice that moment where she pulled herself together and she walked out and did it. Even, and it's like, how could she deny her own heart? And as those moments continued, as I got a little older, I can remember praying and pleading and saying, Lord, let her turn, let this be the moment she, says, Satan, no, I'm not going to do what you want me to do. And I would wait for that, and I call them the almost,
Mhm.
and it'd be like they almost turned, and at that last minute, they went ahead and just complied. And I grieved. The truth was, I grieved those almost moments. And I cried out for them, and it was like, God, why? Why? They were so close. And then, it would come to me where it's like, no, I'm not going to fall into that almost. I'm not going to comply. And that's where I would then fight against the system.
Wow.
But
Takes courage, um, because I believe the majority of people in the system don't want to be, I think you've said that too, don't want to be doing it, but there's so much pressure to conform, so much blackmail, um, and that's hard when your family members are being threatened. We're going to do this to them if
Mhm.
you don't do this. Um,
Yeah.
it's that rock and a hard place.
And courage is that, it really is just that act of standing in your choice
Mhm.
to say, this is what I'm choosing, and no matter what the consequences are, I'm choosing this.
Yeah.
And that's where, when I really started applying that, I found that really the system works off of a lot of empty threats.
Mm.
You have, I'll say, a healthy mix, because we all know that they make it very clear, that, and I think they do it more when you're younger. Um, like when I was younger, it was like, when I refused to comply, then it was the graphic, horrific things I would witness. And it would be like, it's not going to stop until you comply.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, it would go, because I wouldn't comply, they would only go so far. I just didn't know what the limit was.
Mhm.
Um, you know, and so you had to make that choice. Well, am I willing, no matter what they take, including my own life,
Yeah.
am I willing to put that on the line? And, there's always that struggle between the fear of death, because you've seen it in so many graphic and horrific ways, and really it's more the pain. You're afraid to experience that pain and have that death drawn out, because they they draw out the death. Um, but then, when you really stand firm and, you know, remove all their leverage, it's like, okay, fine, you're gonna, take my family members. Well, guess what? I've only got so many. And once they're gone, you now have no more leverage to hold against me ever. And, that was the point I had to come to, that it's like, okay, like if I have to lose everything that I have, let's do it, because then they no longer have anything they can take from me,
Yeah.
and then they have no power. Um, and they wouldn't, that's where I found that there was a bluff, that they weren't going to take those closer to me, because they wanted to keep that power and control through fear and intimidation.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's one of those things where I never thought I was courageous. And a few years ago, when we were learning to enter into the heavenly realm stuff, and the person who was walking us through said, ask God to share with you one thing that he knows about you that you don't know.
Mm.
And it was that word, you are courageous. It was
Oh,
like,
wow.
I'm not courageous. I'm just
You're
a
like,
people
God, do you have
pleaser.
that right? Are you looking at the right file?
Exactly. Exactly. But then as things begin to surface, and I had to choose, am I going to believe the memories that are coming up in relationship with God? It's not just me
Mhm.
daydreaming this up. He's speaking, and I'm seeing things, and
Right.
he's participating in it with me. Am I going to just deny that? Because that's craziness. How could that have ever happened? I look like I
Mhm.
came from the perfect, family. I went to my dad's office probably about a year ago. He's a doctor, and one of the nurses came out and goes, "Oh, your dad is the best dad in the world," and it was like, he's great. But again, it's that all what's out here, you know,
Right.
is hiding what's
The
behind.
truth about it.
And so, having to face things, and sometimes it was like, I'd rather go, that feeling of maybe it'd be better to go back to that perfect family and just pretend, continue to pretend,
Yeah.
Um, but ultimately, we have to be true to ourselves, to God,
Mhm.
and to be accountable with the truth that He, is revealing to us. And it takes
And
courage.
those really, like, you're dealing with the first and the second laws of the brotherhood system.
Mhm.
The first things they train us to do is that you have to keep that code of silence,
Mhm.
and you have to keep your brother's secrets.
Yes.
And I learned, really one of the most impactful healing moments for me was in writing the affidavits. And for some of them, it's like it's so heavy bringing up, trudging up all that sin and wickedness of that individual that we've borne for so many years because we've kept those secrets. We've kept it quiet. We haven't shared what they did. And I can remember, it's like I'm writing down all these details. And then I got to that point where, for me, like, going through it, there were things that I had to keep, memories that, both me or I would, go through and I would do route memory. It's like I would go through every detail of those rituals or those events so that so that it could never be taken from me.
Mhm.
And me and my training partner would ask each other questions throughout the day just randomly. And we knew that if the other person couldn't answer, then that meant that the system had gotten to him and erased things.
Wow.
So that was part of our way of, safeguarding our memories and knowing if, our minds had been messed with or not.
Mm.
Um, so in that process, there were things that I had to remember and make myself remember. And then there were those things that, I called buried with Jesus. It's like, nope, I don't want to think about that. I do not want that to surface. And, even like I suppressed it so much that even, like if it would start to surface in my dreams, I would have little trigger things that I had built in where, um, like at first when I had thought about the room where they would put us after they had put us through the adrenochrome testing to see how much we could take, they would lock us into this small room that had a little white cabinet in it, and they would lock us in that cabinet. So, a lot of times I would dream about that cabinet and I would walk into this room and I could see it in my dream.
Mhm.
But the moment my hand went to open that cabinet, I would flash and wake myself up.
Wow. Wow.
And so I had trained myself where I would not allow my mind to go to some of those memories.
Mhm.
So some of that started surfacing, as I was going into writing the affidavits. And it's like, nope, nope, I know where this memory goes. Nope, I do not want to go there. And the body, because the trauma is so intense,
Mhm.
your body goes into auto reactions where you start to panic, you start to get really anxious. My body, like I lose all temperature
Hmm.
where I get very cold. I start where I can't, numb, I can't feel things. And, so I had to learn to work through that where, it's like, okay, I'm starting to get that feeling. I would go heat up my heat pack and I would give my hands something to feel like, so like with my heat pack, I'll kind of squish it. I'll keep my hand moving. And that helps me then to continue processing those deeper horrific memories. And so, with the one, I was sitting there and I was like, I paused because I noticed that I was starting to, my body was starting to auto react.
Mhm.
And I had prayer partners that were praying for me as I was writing those and helping me walk through it. And I said, the truth is, I don't want to ever reveal the full extent of what happened in that memory. Like,
Mhm.
I don't want to bring that out. So then they were like, well, wrestle with that question.
Mhm.
Why don't you? Like, this is your moment where you're bringing forth the extent of, your proctor's wickedness, but they're like, you have a choice. And it's like, you're right. I do have a choice.
Mhm.
And as I looked over things, it's like, I have enough. Like, I have enough that's needed to convict. I have enough that brings out the truth that shows them what happened. And then the freeing thought that the Lord gave me was that I have the right to choose grace.
Yes.
And that grace is that I won't ever reveal to the world the full extent of her wickedness. and I'm choosing to forgive it. I'm choosing to let it go. And I'm choosing to give myself permission to not force up those memories. And it's like, Lord, if you want or in your time, we can deal with it. But if not, there's enough. I don't need to think about what I know she did.
Mhm.
And the truth is that it's there, the memory's there, but I just don't want to think or entertain it because of all the emotions that are negative that go with it, that deep grief and sadness. And we can give ourselves that permission to say, you know, we're choosing grace and forgiveness, and we don't have to, we don't have to trudge up those things. And that's okay. It's okay just to say, it was so horrific that I don't want it to ever come back to life. Even in my memories or my thoughts, I do not want it to surface. And I'm going to leave it buried with Jesus. And I'm going to live this new life that He's given me. I lived through that.
Yeah.
And just to say I lived through it. And now I'm going to live in spite of all of that. I'm just going to live. So.
That's so amazing. I guess maybe two questions. One is, or thoughts just to ponder. We've been talking in one of our groups about injustice. What is justice
Mhm.
on a spiritual level and then on the natural level? And then, whichever one you want to answer. The other part is I'm just curious about what prompted you to take that step to do the reporting, to do the affidavits. Um, and, if you don't mind sharing just kind of that process of getting to that point.
Yeah, so up until then, I had already federally turned in reports on the information I had already shared, my testimony. Um, it was kind of a twofold thing. One was that, after all those years, um, the I'll just say the military JAGs, the individuals that I was working with in that, as I turned in reports, one of the last ones before that, involved my proctor calling me the night of my birthday and basically in code telling me where she was going to be ritually sacrificing the children that year on behalf of my birthday.
Mm,
I had turned that in. And so what happened later after that, a few months, I was sitting across the table from one of the individuals involved in um, responding to that report. And, for the first time in my life, like, for the majority of us, um, there may not be witnesses that we're aware of or witnesses who will come forward. You live in that dual world where everybody pretends that, you're just living your cover lives and nothing of the other life ever happens.
mhm,
It literally is denied, suppressed. You don't air it, you don't talk about it. Um, so for the first time in my life, somebody acknowledged.
mm,
And he said to me, my God, what a mess. And he's crying.
mm,
And, it's like the first time you're like, wow, it's not just in my head, like, it happens, this is what they do, but to actually have somebody else acknowledge things that you've witnessed or seen on a regular basis. And that individual is the one who said to me, I want your testimony in affidavit form. So that's, it was like, yep, it's time, you know. So that's when I started putting it in affidavit form.
it's so good. So good. And
Yeah.
I don't feel like there's a discrepancy between reporting and forgiving. Um,
No. Yeah, it's hard for the people pleasers because we feel like we're betraying or um I don't know what another word would be, but we feel like we're breaking that relationship, that trust. Um, for me, there was some challenges in that emotionally because you grieve. You're battling against your own heart and your desires. And my desires for, you know, the people in the system and particularly my proctor,
Mhm.
what I really wanted was for her just to stop.
Yeah.
I wanted her to stop killing, stop maiming, stop torturing. Um, and I really did desire her to come to the Lord. That was my heart's cry. So, in that, I've never wanted her, um, you know, harm to come to her. There were, to be honest, there were times where, there's a difference between like, when you dwell on wishing harm on somebody and those moments where, it goes through your head where, you're watching them commit such horrific traumas that the thought goes across your mind where you're angry and you're like, I just want to stop her. However I need to, I want to stop her.
Yeah.
And I have to be honest that there were moments that I came to that place where my anger burned against her. And, there were moments that some of the other teachers in the system, particularly Michael Carcock,
Mhm.
he put things in place to prevent me from, being able to express that anger in its fullness. Um, so they knew that she had tipped that pot. And, but then, as things subsided, um, I went back to that true desire of my heart, which was, I wanted her to come out.
Mhm.
And then I began, as I got out of the system, I really began to invite her to a lot of our church events, invite her to participate in things with me, and really, where I was sharing the gospel, I was sharing the truth about God. Um, I was showing her how to live out that life, uh, and so that's where the shift came is that I kind of turned it into action.
Yeah.
And it was a choice.
Mhm.
I chose to forgive and I chose to love her. And even to the point where, probably about 10, 12 years ago, the Lord had showed me how to really encourage people. And I had the thought, I was like, I don't know if anybody has ever said a kind word to her once in her life.
Mm.
Her mother was just a viciously mean woman,
Yeah.
old school, strict German, that ruled the home with the ruler
Mhm.
and, just very vicious with the tongue. And I was like, I don't think anybody has ever said something kind or nice to her about herself.
Mhm.
And so then it was like, well, Lord, I want to say something nice about her. But as I sat and thought about it, it was like, God, I don't have one nice thing I can say about her. I was like, Lord, give me one thing.
Mhm.
And as I really sought the Lord and prayed hard on it, all of a sudden the Lord, brought to my mind that even though it was in her cover life, um, that she indeed had, remained in that marriage for 50 years
Mm.
and had stayed with that individual. So it was like, they really went through a lot together.
Yes.
And so that became the point where I could say, I appreciate,
Mhm.
the example that you've laid for me, that you've stuck in that marriage through the difficult and the hard times. You've remained committed. In the end, really, it was a beautiful thing because she ended up being the caregiver for her husband.
Oh.
And that was a place she had never been in her life before. And so the Lord really opened that door for me to minister to her through that time. And, we really got close at that time in a good and a healthy way.
Mhm.
That was like our healthy, relational um, opportunities that we had. And the Lord really used that situation to minister to her to the point where her husband, he ended up having dementia. And he in his like he had been somebody that was very, his cover was to go to Catholic church for every mass, but really he was a high level Mason.
Mm.
And you know in that dementia, it opened that door for him to seek God.
Wow.
And my mother and one of my aunts had led him to the Lord. And then in his innocence, in that dementia, he would request every day for my proctor to read him the scripture. So, imagine the irony of that. God has the Queen Mother of Darkness reading scripture to her husband every day.
Wow.
But the sweetness in that, I mean, the sweetness in that the Lord continued and continues to call her to come out of that darkness in every way that he can, and using every opportunity that he can to show her how much he loves her.
Mhm.
And so it's interesting to see
Wow.
what the Lord has done through all that time.
And I think that's so powerful, particularly because so many survivors are counseled to stay away, get out of the system, cut off ties. And in some cases, and maybe in the early stages,
Yeah, you
that
have
is
to. You
necessary.
have to.
Yeah. But when you see it as ultimately the goal is for me to get healed enough that
Mhm.
I can re-engage with the power of the Holy Spirit, power of Jesus
Right.
Christ, to, hopefully, bring them back to a place where they're able to
Yeah.
receive Jesus.
And not being afraid to address them,
Mhm.
you know? I mean, I remember the first time I addressed her about Satan and communications with Satan, and, you know, I just came out and I said, "We've got these groups in our neighborhood, um, that are preaching Satan." And there was utter silence on the phone as she said, "Did you just say Satan?" I was like, "Yes, I did." And I could tell when she gets really mad, she will start to grind her teeth. Like she'll talk, but she'll grit her teeth in the back. And she was doing that, you know, and she said, "Well, I guess that sure gives you a lot to pray about."
Wow.
And I mean, that was like her cut saying, "You're not gonna do anything. Here's the narrative. You're just gonna pray about that." And I said to her, I said, "Oh no." I said, "You know me." I said, "I'm gonna totally engage, and I wanna meet them and know all their names, and I'm all in. I'm gonna know these people in my community." She
Wow.
was so mad, she actually hung up the phone. That was the first time she ever hung up the phone on me,
Wow.
and then she did some stuff after that, um, really to just, like, try to get back or get retribution.
Mhm.
But, it's interesting because you know, she's had to find out the hard way that I've brought everything forward, and to be in that place then where, you know, the family's not gonna they're just not gonna talk about it. It's the big elephant in the room, and I wish they would.
Yeah.
It's like who's gonna have the courage to say, "Hey, this evil needs to not continue. We're not okay with it. We don't wanna be a part of it." And, behind it is not just the retaliation from the people, but when you add, there's some individuals who've just had, trauma on the physical plane or spiritual trauma here, and it doesn't connect to the satanic ritual. But when you connect it to the satanic ritual and you have family members that, you know, you're not just getting threats from people, you're getting threats from demonic spirits as well that are trying to keep you in line. And so that's really what's behind that silence in the family, is that they don't want that demonic kickback. They're terrified of the demonic. And when you can break that fear of, and to say, no, I have authority in Christ.
Mhm.
I have the authority to say to these spirits, I rebuke you.
Yes.
And I'm not going to be held in that bondage of fear. And I am going to speak out the truth. And I am going to give my testimony in its fullness, not the watered down, approved narrative version that has been approved for me to tell. I'm going to tell the details and I'm going to name names. Um, that's where the battle begins. And you have a decision to make. Are you going to, we have armor that's meant to be our defense,
Yeah.
meant to take the blows of the attack, but we also have a sword.
Mhm.
Are we just going to stand there and hold our sword? Or are we going to go forward in the power of the Lord and go on the offense and who's God really made us to be?
Yeah.
He doesn't want those strongholds in our communities, in our homes, in our churches. He doesn't want the places of wickedness to continue. And he says that throughout the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament, if you will tear down the strongholds of wickedness, then I will drive out the enemy from before you. So it's a promise that he's made. But how do you tear down those strongholds? We're talking spiritual strongholds here. It starts by speaking out the truth
Yes.
and sharing your story about what's happened to you. And as you speak that out, watch as you enter into that place and say, Lord, I'm ready, I'm willing. Show me what to say, when to say it. And the Lord's going to open those doors, and you're going to watch as that power of evil and wickedness is broken. That's how we get to that place of overcoming and victory. It's that trust that as we, you know, his word says in Revelations that we overcome the evil one by the word of our testimony and the blood of the Lamb.
Yes.
As we go forward in obedience, giving our testimony, we're covered in the blood of the Lamb, and the Spirit of God goes before us to prepare the way. So it's a twofold work, and we have an amazing God and Savior who walks with us through that every way. He fights for us. He goes before us and fights for us and clears that path so that we can come forward with our testimony. And that's where the power is once
Absolutely.
we realize that we're not in it alone. We're not, having to go out on the forefront all on our own. We are literally going right behind the Lord, following as He conquers the enemy in front of us and makes that way for us to safely share our testimony.
I so love that, and I could not agree more. And I love that even detractors who may be watching this very video, that they are hearing the message of the truth of the true Lord Jesus Christ and His power and His love. And so
Amen.
it's
Yeah.
amazing. It's amazing. And so just encouraging those of you who are watching, you have a testimony too. And,
Hmm.
for me, I've found this journey is not just about my healing and my journey, but is how much damage I can do to the kingdom of darkness along the way. And, I want
That's where that justice feeling comes in.
yes,
You
yes,
feel justified as the Lord goes out and tears down the wickedness
yes.
as He brings it to the surface in the light.
And ultimately, it's all about love because there's so many people trapped in this system. And when we can take that system down so that they can be set free, I am
Mhm.
believing that the biggest harvest to come is those from the system. And
Yeah,
I'm calling it
absolutely.
forth.
Amen. Yes, we're shaking that forth, calling it forth. And there is such, freedom. It's hard when you're in that place of, um, that place of still being angry, still being hurt, still being traumatized and victimized, um, to think on or even look at. those who've been your abusers
Mhm.
and to say, I want something different for you.
Yeah.
Because a lot of us, we entertain thoughts that are not good because towards those people because we want to feel justified. We want retribution.
Mhm.
Um, we want to have that hurt, that pain acknowledged by them.
Mhm.
We want them to know how much they've hurt us and how much pain they've caused.
Yeah.
But to come to that place where you shift that
Mhm.
and you say, okay, Lord, not my will,
Mhm.
because when we look at our will, where would it go?
Yeah.
It would go to death or destruction.
Mhm.
But when we say, Lord, not my will, but yours,
Yes.
um, God's plan for that individual based on their heart, He very well may end up taking that person home.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that most of the time, He really wants to work a miracle. He wants to do
Yes.
something that hasn't been seen before.
Yes.
And He wants to display that, to display the work of His hands and how beautiful it can be. And I remember, coming out of the system, around age 10, the Lord, how He started to really grow my faith was through missionary books.
Mhm.
I began to read all these books, and the one that literally stopped me in my tracks was Elizabeth Elliot's Beyond the Gates of
Yes.
Splendor.
I love that.
And, when I got to the part where, the women after their husbands had been killed by the tribal people in the Amazon, the women remained faithful and they moved into the village to provide education and to help them learn medical things um, and they moved with their children. And the story about the pilot who had died, his son Nate,
Mhm.
um, who befriended the very man who killed his
Yes.
father, and they would have these little conversations. And the one day, you know, I think the little I think Nate had asked him, "Why didn't you come to church?" or something like that. I haven't read the story for a long time, but he asked him something, and the man replies, he said, "I saw your father cross over."
Wow.
He said, "I know there's a God, but I don't feel worthy
Mhm.
that God will accept me because of I took the life."
Mhm.
And I think Nate had held out his hand and took him by the hand, and that was when the Lord caused that miracle, that shift. And that man ended up going to church with them, entering into prayer, and he came to know the Lord and became like a grandfather
Mm.
and
Mm.
raised Nate up the rest of the way. And then years later, now they've put out the movie and they have some of the real footage where this man who had murdered his father travels with him now, and they tell the story together and share their testimonies together. And I mean, I just sit there and it's like, Lord, I'm floored. It's like I just tear up and I cry and I bawl, and it's like, God, there's nothing more beautiful. Like, that's what I desire. I desire them to come forward and share their stories. Um, and it's like, if I could ask for justice in any way, there's no bigger kickback to Satan than to watch his top generals
Yes.
serving the Lord. So it's like, Lord, that's what I want.
Yep.
It's like
Yes.
that's what I want for justice. Because at the end of the day, you know, my true anger is not just against people. My true anger is against God's enemy who has stolen and he's come to steal, kill, and destroy from us. And I want justice with him, you
Yeah.
know. So it's like, Lord, please shake that justice free. Shake it free quickly.
Oh, I so, so, so agree. To me, that is the triumph of God's love, that is so beyond anything we can think or imagine.
Yeah.
And I want to be part of that, and I understand for survivors. And I would say like, um, a good share of my perpetrators, I've been able to work through to be that point. Some
Mhm.
I've not processed all the emotion yet, and that's okay. I'm not there yet, but I
Yeah.
know I'm going to get there. And so it's not a bypassing, spiritual bypassing and going, oh, the correct posture and to be perfect would be just to bypass all my feelings, emotions, and pain and
Yeah.
trauma and just, oh, I'm just nobly forgiving them and hoping they'll come to the Lord. No, it is a deep work we got to do. But
Yeah.
the end goal, that we want to keep our eyes focused on is that triumph of God's love that goes beyond what we can think or imagine.
Absolutely. And there was an exercise, the first half of the exercise, a friend had taught me how to do. And it was, like addressing not even face to face, but I did it in my prayer journal,
Mhm,
but addressing those that your perpetrators,
mhm.
and saying, I forgive you for.
Wow.
And the most helpful thing she said to me was she said, don't make it just one or two words. If you need to be descriptive, get into the hurts and address the emotions too. So that became really helpful, and I started to do that. And then as I did that, the Lord started to address some of the deeper things. And the Lord said, there was a desire there that you had in that relationship that was never met.
Yeah, wow.
And that's where the forgiveness needs to happen. So it was like, you're right, Lord, there was. So, like, even in my, back to my proctor and stuff, um, it was a family, close family relationship.
Mhm,
That individual I did have on my other side, on my father's side, the person on that role was very loving, very affectionate, a safe relationship. I could hug that person, I could be held in her arms, and that's what I desired from my proctor.
yeah.
But what became the safe in that relationship was that it's okay for us, we'll be in the same room together, but I'm going to always have that space because I'm never going to let you touch me because I don't trust you.
Yeah.
So, as I worked through things, it was like, I forgive you for, the torture. Like when I heard things, she would poke me with needles.
Mm,
And so it's like, I forgive you for poking me with needles. And the Lord took it further to what was behind that. There was fear because sometimes those needles would have a paralyzer on them. And then I wouldn't be able to even defend myself.
mm,
So it's like, I forgive you for putting me in a place where I couldn't defend myself, where I feared you were going to take my life, or you were going to harm me, or you were making me stand there and watch other people get harmed and I could do nothing about it.
mhm,
And then I forgive you for, rejecting or denying or not allowing me those moments. What I really wanted was to be held. I wanted to be comforted. I wanted you to make me feel safe. I really desired you to be a safe relationship.
wow, wow. Yeah.
That's the heart of it. I desired that safe relationship. And then what's behind it, as a young child, I really adored her.
Mm,
I wanted to have that good relationship. I wanted her to be like my other side of the family. I wanted that with her too.
yeah.
And to not be able to have that, that's where the real hurt and the unforgiveness lied, was at the depths of that. Um, and then the overcoming comes as you forgive, to say, even though you may choose not to have that type of relationship and you did that all through our childhood,
Mhm,
I'm choosing now to still give you the opportunities. And I'm going to help create those opportunities. I'm going to reach out. I'm going to invite you into healthy situations. I'm going to choose to conversate with you in a loving way about what's happening in your life now. I'm going to choose not to address the past or bring up the record of wrongs against you. I'm going to choose just to be here and now. And I want it to be good. I want it to be beautiful for both of us. And that's how we get from that point A to point B. And it's a process.
Yeah.
And giving yourself permission in the process to say, you know what, today I'm not ready to make that call and invite that person to lunch.
Yeah.
But then to say, okay, I'm going to work on it. Where's the unforgiveness still? Where's the thing that's holding me back from being in that place of loving? Because that's the first thing that we learn to withhold is love. And here's where the enemy gets his access point with that unforgiveness. Withholding love is actually a sin because God commands us to love.
Yes, even our enemies.
So even our enemies. So he keeps us in that place of sin and unrighteousness by that withholding. Now, we'll clarify that if you have a perpetrator or individual that is actively, abusing, it's okay to draw that boundary and not have that relationship.
Yes.
Some relationships, in all honesty, some relationships you have to end. And that's okay. But for those, and the Lord will show you as you ask the Lord, he's going to show you if he wants to do something with that relationship or if you're to end it. So trust that. Trust the Lord in that. And don't put yourself, don't make yourself feel like you have to put yourself in that bad relationship over and over again. That's not what we're saying.
Yeah.
But for those relationships that the Lord wants to do something else in, a miracle, that's kind of how we walk through point A to point B.
That is so, so good, Jessie. I love this conversation. Always about the triumph of God's love in every situation, and even in those boundaries, and restraining evil. His love still triumphs, and that's the miracle. And so thank you so much, Jessie, for being with us today. I've really, really, really enjoyed this conversation and just want to speak life and love and peace and help to those of you out there who may be struggling in these areas, to know that there is a path to freedom, to life, to healing, and to health. And so just encourage you. Jessie has great resources at kingdomlivingwithjessie.com. As well as we have resources as well, our transformation course, Transformations Becoming Who You Are. And so we just honor you, bless you. If you've got a testimony to share, we would love to hear it. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time on Testimony Mountain.